All right, thank you to everybody who's still coming in. It looks like we are right at the top of the hour. I would like to go ahead and just take care of a few housekeeping notes. So first, I'd again just like to thank everybody for joining us on this second quarterly update. Everyone is joined in listen-only mode, but there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So there's kind of a chat and question feature. If you want to go ahead and submit questions during the presentation, we'll then hold them and review them and have a time to read those out and have our presenters respond. I did also want to note that just in terms of this webinar platform, if you kind of have a tool panel on the side of your screen and that's blocking your view of the slides, there's kind of an orange arrow that you can press to either hide or bring back that control panel as needed. I did also want to note that we are recording the webinar today, and that recording will be posted to the SACS website, as well as the PDF of the slides following today's presentation. With that, I'd like to hand it over to the Regional Project Manager, Pam Kasten, to get us started.
All righty, next slide, please. So thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that. Again, I am Pam Kasten, as Jenny's indicated, with the Corps of Engineers, Wilmington District in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I am the Regional Project Manager for the Corps' South Atlantic Coastal Study. Now, as most of you are aware, the South Atlantic Coastal Study is working with a broad stakeholder platform to identify risk and develop strategies to improve resilience across tidally influenced areas of 8 states and territories throughout the Southeast and the Caribbean. Now, I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our quarterly update on study progress and activities since the last time we presented to you back in March of this year. Now, I'm going to keep my introductory remarks fairly short as we've got a lot of terrific information to share with you today, and we're going to jump right in. Now, again, although this update will focus on accomplishments over the last 3 months, we may have some participants today who are new to our collaborative study team, so I'm just going to set the stage with some overall study context. Next slide, please. So for our agenda today, I'm just going to refresh everyone on the composition of our study team and our shared vision statement and provide kind of a 30,000-foot view of where we are in our overall study schedule. Then our command center team will each provide an update on regional study products that have been completed in the last 3 months or that are underway, followed by our district project managers who will give you a summary of accomplishments and upcoming activities. We've got a lot going on for each of the state and territory appendices. We'll then highlight what's up next over the coming 3 months, and then try to leave about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A through the chat function of the webinar at the tail end. Next slide, please. So our South Atlantic Coastal Study team consists of a command center team of regional discipline leads that are working together from various Corps of Engineers districts within South Atlantic Division. Now, each of the 5 Corps districts also staff a project delivery team working hard on the 8 state and territory appendices within their area of responsibility. So each of these folks will introduce themselves as they provide you with their updates, and their contact information is contained at the back end of the presentation. This presentation will be made available for you to download off the study's webpage. Next slide, please. So Congress has directed that the Corps of Engineers complete this study within a total of 4 years. Now, the study was initiated in August of 2018, and as you can see by the yellow bar on this slide, we are almost at the halfway mark in the study schedule. Another thing that's really pretty clear from this slide is that 2020 has been and continues to be a very busy year for the study team as we work on a wide variety of technical products supporting regional risk analyses and a more detailed assessment of risk and risk reduction opportunities within each state, territory, and high-risk focus areas. The draft report will be complete for public review next October, with the final report due over the finish line in August of 2022. Next slide, please. So our study's shared vision statement constitutes our shared understanding with you, our stakeholders, of the desired end state in managing coastal risk in our region, developed collaboratively with you over the course of this past year. Now, it's useful to always keep this statement in mind, as it really is the metric against which ultimately our study success will be measured. So again, specifically, the South Atlantic Coastal Study vision is to provide a common understanding of risk from coastal storms and sea level rise to support resilient communities and habitats. This collaborative effort will leverage stakeholders' actions to plan and implement cohesive coastal storm risk management strategies along the South Atlantic and Gulf Coast shorelines, including the territories of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. So this key product slide is also available on our studies webpage for you to take a closer look at. Now, our team will be providing you today with an overview of the products that are circled in red. As you may recall, our Tier 1 risk assessment is already completed and available through our GeoPortal, and the Regional Sediment Management Optimization Report is also complete and available on our webpage. Next slide, please. So at this time, I'd like to turn the mic over to our Command Center team for their progress briefs, beginning with Lisa Clark, our outreach lead. Lisa?
Lisa, you're muted if you are trying to speak.
I'm sorry. Yeah, good afternoon. This is Lisa Clark. I am the South Atlantic Coastal Study Outreach Lead, and I work outside of the Jacksonville District. And looking at my slide here, you'll see on the top left is the makeup of our stakeholders. There are more than 1,200 plus stakeholders that we have throughout the study area, and this number continues to grow as we continue to engage with you, our stakeholders. Looking at the top right is a picture of the newsletters which we began creating in January. These issues are posted to our website, and the June issue is currently under development and will be available on our website during the first full week of July. On the bottom left, you'll see this is a picture of what our website looks like. This is where we post new information as it becomes available. There are links to previous webinars, the GeoPortal, various study products, and a link to be added to our email distribution list if you're not already on our email distribution list. And there's lots of other great information. On the bottom right, that is our email address, sacs@usace.army.mil. And there's also the link to our GeoPortal, which has the SACS Tier 1 Risk Assessment Viewer. Thank you very much. And now I will pass it over to Dr. Clay McCoy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Clay McCoy. I'm the RSM lead on the command team and also the PM of the SAND study. SAND stands for Sand Availability and Needs Determination, and it's a study to determine the 50-year sand needs for all beach projects in the South Atlantic Division, both federal and non-federal projects, and to determine the available sand resources in the region, both offshore, nearshore, RSM, and beneficial use sources, as well as upland. And so it's the first regional assessment of its kind, and the project is managed by a team including state and federal resource agencies, and is contracted to Taylor Engineering out of Jacksonville, Florida. Over the last quarter, we completed our assessment. We held in-house workshops to go over the data and prepare for our district workshops, and we conducted those workshops over the last couple of weeks. We got a lot of great feedback from stakeholders that will strengthen and make the final products more accurate. If you are unable to attend or want to see those presentations, I have the link to an FTP site on the screen here. And if you have any questions, comments, or additional data, please send that information to us by the end of this week, July 3rd. After that, we're going to finalize the database and start writing up the report. And so the report should be on the SACS website by the end of October at the latest. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of the preliminary results. We have about 1.2 billion cubic yards of sand needs in the division and we have roughly the same amount of sand available. All states can meet their overall sand needs with identified resources except for Georgia, but the sand is not where we need it to be in all cases. So if you take a look at this map, the red and orange spots identify the deficits, and as you can see, much of North Carolina is in a deficit, as well as South Florida, much of the panhandle of Florida, and Mississippi. Next slide, please. Okay, this is our final slide. So preliminary recommendations and next steps. The sand resources, excuse me, are primarily based on RSM and beneficial use and these offshore proven and potential resources. And so we didn't include the unverified plus category in our offshore database when we were calculating volumes. And so we're going to suggest to look in these unverified plus areas. These are areas that have some level of data to suggest that sand resources are available. And we're going to say to look there first, and we're going to work with our team that we've put together to help prioritize that. We're going to promote innovation to improve efficiencies from borrow areas and dredging losses, supporting R&D such as screening, sorting, getting more efficient with unexploded ordnance areas and environmental buffers and things like that. And we're also going to look at flexibility in state regulations as opportunities to utilize sources to place them in near shore and expand our beneficial use placement strategy. So thank you for your time. And now I'm going to hand off to Trevor Lancaster to talk about some of the progress with the SACS geospatial program. Thank you.
Thanks, Clay. Good afternoon. This is Trevor Lancaster from the Wilmington District with an update for the geospatial activities for this past quarter. This spring, we finalized the Tier 1 risk assessment for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We had to take a slightly different approach to the territories since several of the data sets utilized in our analysis for the mainland did not include features for Puerto Rico and the USVI. We were able to supplement various infrastructure data sets with local and regional data sourced from the territory governments and the University of the Virgin Islands. For Puerto Rico, given the availability of the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index to the census tract level, we maintain this level of detail for the population and infrastructure indices, similarly to the mainland. For the U.S. Virgin Islands, unfortunately, the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index was not calculated, so we use this as an opportunity to refine our aggregation boundary down to the estate level for the population and infrastructure indices. The various hazard, exposure, and risk indices for the territories are available on the SACS Tier 1 Risk Assessment Viewer. We have several geospatial products currently in development. Now that we've completed the Tier 1 for the territories, we'll be standing up a Tier 1 download web application that will allow users to download the various Tier 1 indices and associated metadata by state or territory. Additionally, we are in the process of building out a web application for the HAZUS model results that Idris Dobbs will touch on next. These will include estimated dollar damages to the census block level for existing and future flood events. Similarly, we'll be building out state and territory appendix web applications that will allow users to visualize Tier 2 data sets that complement the SACS state and territory appendices. Additionally, we are building out an open data page on our SACS ArcGIS Online organization site. This site will allow users to discover, access, and visualize all the geospatial products and data sets from the SACS. Lastly, we're actively providing geospatial support to the SACS environmental team for analyzing the vulnerability of habitats within our study area to coastal storm hazards, which Christina May will be touching on shortly. That concludes my update, and now I'll pass it off to Idris Dobbs for an economics update.
Idris, are you on mute?
Yeah, his audio looks to be off at the moment. Let's just give him a minute or a couple of seconds to see if he comes online. Idris, I think you might need to re-enter your PIN. I'm not sure if you left audio and came back on.
Jenny, otherwise we can move, just move
You want to
to
move
our
to the
next
next?
and give
We
Idris
can
another
come back
couple.
to this section. Sure. I think that brings us to Matt, if you want to give an update.
Yep. All right, thanks. So I'm Matt Schrader. I'm the planning lead from the command team for the study. I sit in the Jacksonville district. I'm going to brief on a couple overall planning efforts that have been going on over the past several months. And then district PMs are going to provide some specific state and territory information later on in today's presentation. So the first effort that's shown up on your screen is compiling summary tables like this one. This is just an example for Northeast Florida that summarize the Tier 1 and Tier 2 analyses that have identified high-risk locations. As we discussed on past webinars, the SACS Tier 1 evaluated potential risk across the entire study area, all 65,000 miles of shoreline, using national level data sets in order to provide a consistent picture of existing and future risk. This information is available on that Tier 1 risk assessment viewer, and Lisa Clark had the link to it on her slide, so you can see the Tier 1 results there. In Tier 2, districts use more specific state and territory data to add to and refine the Tier 1 output. And an example of Tier 2 data is a HAZUS analysis that Idris will go through later on today. Although HAZUS was run for the whole study area, the data was evaluated in specific ways that may differ from state to state, so it's considered Tier 2. So these efforts are currently ongoing, with the next steps being to add pertinent Tier 2 environmental and cultural resource considerations. And if you click the button, I'm going to highlight these next two sections of the table on the next two slides, going to zoom in and provide some explanation of the data that we used. So next slide, please. So here's the Tier 1 section of that summary table that I just had up. As shown in the text at the top of the table on the right, Tier 1 evaluated storm surge inundation impacts to population, infrastructure, environmental, and cultural resources. This evaluation resulted in the Tier 1 composite risk index, and an example of that is shown in the lower left. That's a snapshot of the composite risk index for a section of Northeast Florida. So in order to determine potential high-risk locations under Tier 1, the composite risk index was overlain with U.S. Census place boundaries, and those are highlighted in yellow in that snapshot. Then two thresholds were used to determine if a census place exhibited potential high risk, and those were that the amber or red colors, which signify medium, high, and high potential risk, they needed to cover at least 50 acres and 0.5%, at least 0.5% of a census place. If these criteria were met in either the existing condition or the future condition, and that future condition includes 3 feet of sea level rise, you'll see an X under the corresponding column in the table, and you can see those in the clip to the right. Next slide, please. Tier 2 data was then added to refine the locations that were identified in Tier 1. So in this example, again, using Northeast Florida, HAZUS data was added to the table. And the HAZUS data refines potential high-risk locations identified in Tier 1 by giving an approximation of the dollar damages to assets and infrastructure. The other real benefit of the HAZUS data was that it allowed teams to identify additional locations that may have significant existing or future damages from inundation, since the HAZUS data is available for areas outside of census places. Also, in this example, again, this is for Florida, teams pulled on state-specific information. So in this case, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's critical erosion areas, where the state has identified either infrastructure, recreational resources, wildlife habitat, or cultural resources that are at risk from erosion. And particularly for Tier 2, incorporating erosion into the analysis added another layer of refinement to the risk, as well as identifying locations that may have significant risk that are just driven by erosion and not so much by storm surge inundation. Next slide, please. Future development was also considered, and we pulled some maps like this together over the past several months. We've done these for each planning reach, and the one that's shown as an example on the screen is for Alabama. The maps display storm surge inundation from the 1% and 10% annual exceedance probability events, plus 3 feet of sea level rise. So what these are showing as far as inundation, they're a future hazard that could occur within 50 to 100 years, depending on the sea level rise assumptions used. These hazards were then compared to future coastal residential development projections through 2100, and those are highlighted in red. These came from the EPA's ICLUS effort to provide a high-level comparison of where future development could overlap with areas inundated by storm surge. This type of information could be useful to stakeholder planning efforts as well as focus area efforts, which we're going to discuss more in the upcoming slides. It's really important to note that the EPA has pointed out that the ICLUS data does not include all local land use or planning and development considerations, so that needs to be considered when zooming into more regional and local levels and using this type of data. Next slide. So the evaluations I just went over cover the entire SAC study area, and they're going to assist in identifying and addressing risk in all high-risk locations. A subset of those high-risk locations have been compiled into focus areas that were developed with Tier 1 information, input from stakeholders, as well as input that we got from stakeholders at the regional workshops in 2019 and other information. At least one focus area has been identified for each state and territory, and the selected areas are shown on the right side of this slide. Focus area action strategies, or FAS, will be developed for each area in coordination with stakeholders using SACS products and other available resources to identify coordinated actions to reduce risk. It's really important to note that SACS is not only considering focus areas from here on out. High-risk locations, as you all know, will definitely exist outside of focus areas, and the action strategies will be used as examples of how SACS tools and other information can be used to address coastal storm risk in a variety of environments. And recommendations ultimately made by the SACS are not limited only to focus areas. Next slide. So district PMs are going to provide more details on upcoming focus area work later in this presentation, including upcoming workshops, which will be held for each of the focus areas. But I just wanted to give a quick overview of the workshop structure, particularly since they were originally intended to be in-person working meetings with breakout groups, kind of similar to the regional workshops, which many of you attended in 2019. However, due to the travel and in-person meeting limitations due to COVID, the workshops have been broken up into 3 separate webinars in the structure that you see on the screen. So the first, all the way to the left, is a kickoff webinar being scheduled for between July 6th and 17th, where we'll present the virtual format, workshop goals, and some introductory material on the focus area. Webinar number 2 will be the strategy portion of the workshop, and this will refine information that was provided at the regional workshops, also information that stakeholders have provided to date, as well as during and after information provided by stakeholders during and after that initial kickoff meeting. Webinar number 3 will be a wrap-up to go over the draft strategy with focus area stakeholders. And so that's going to be the structure that we're going to have that incorporates the entire focus area workshops. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Christina May to discuss environmental components of the SACS.
I think it looks like we have our previous presenter we needed to skip back on the line. Idris, if your line is open, we can cover the economics section.
Okay, can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can. We'll get back to your slide. There you go.
Okay, so we're currently on slide 16 for those who need to follow along. So economic risk consists of depreciated replacement losses of public and private property due to coastal storm surge events. It was computed using FEMA loss mitigation tools, HAZUS, and the FAST tool. So this includes asset structure and content valuations. The risk is characterized as expected annualized damages from a combination of 10-year, in some cases for the OCONUS, 20-year, 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year events, all described in dollar damages. The risk is also estimated based on existing conditions and under future sea level change conditions. In terms of spatial extent, we estimated economic risk for all coastal areas within the zone of tidal influence for North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, as well as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, as part of the Tier 2 risk assessment. The levels of spatial aggregation of the risk range from census block to census tract to census place to county to planning region and state/territory. So this allows us to determine the spatial distribution of relative risk. So this information, as alluded to by Matt, is used in augmenting the identification of potential high-risk areas and will assist in development of focus area action strategies by comparing the risk of an area with the likely cost of risk reduction options in that area. So the graphic that you see is basically just an example of a dashboard configuration showing the distribution of dollar damage risk for just the CONUS areas, with the roll-ups at the top showing existing dollar damage risk as opposed to future dollar damage risk or under a condition of sea level change. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of progress on the Measures and Costs Library, for those who are new to the SACS, the Measures and Costs Library, or MCL, is an array of coastal storm risk reduction measures, as well as their associated costs for those measures, described at a level of detail suitable for screening level coastal storm risk management planning activity. So the conceptual risk framework shown here is pulled from the ER 1105-2-101, where the risk is a function of the hazard, system performance, exposure, vulnerability, and the consequences. So each of these elements should be considered as part of the coastal storm risk management planning process. So in terms of hazards, that consist of the inundation, wave attack, and the erosion caused by the coastal storm that leads to the harm. And this should theoretically map to your description of the problem. System performance deals with the configuration of the land-water interfaces, the natural environment, and the development environment that determine how the hazard is going to be managed. Your exposure describes who or what is subject to the harm, as well as where the harm is anticipated to occur. For this, it's important to have a clear understanding of the object of the desired risk reduction. Vulnerability is the susceptibility of the exposure to the harm, and the consequences is essentially a description of the harm as a performance metric. So as you can see from the graph, from the figure, basically entails a measure philosophy. You can either manage the hazard in terms of armor, stabilize, or restore the shoreline. You can reduce the exposure in terms of buyout or retreat, or you can increase the resiliency of the exposure by raising assets, wet and dry flood proofing, and such. So the Measures and Costs Library consists of non-structural, structural, and natural and nature-based feature options that factor in regional location, as well as uncertainty in terms of materials and unit cost. The final costs are shown as total construction costs and depicted in terms of life cycle annualized terms in order to be compared with the damages that I spoke to on the previous slide. Next slide, please. Okay, we are on slide 18. The Measures and Costs Library present activities include quality control of the Measures and Costs Library, as well as completion of the technical write-ups. Our near future considerations include better linkage of the dollar damage risk estimates and the shoreline types, improved linkages of the Measures and Costs Library and the shoreline types, and finalization of the MCL documentation by a contractor. Our future activities and considerations will be development of a data model linking the Tier 2 economic risk estimates with the MCL, development of web tools accessible to the public to assist with screening level coastal storm risk management planning level activities. And basically the infographics that you see on the slide basically depict the spatial distribution of dollar damage risk in CONUS areas at the top, and the bottom infographic displays the spatial distribution of shoreline types and exposure to wave and tidal energy by state and planning reach. Now I would like to introduce Christina May, who's our environmental lead on the study.
Thanks, Idris. Hi, I'm Christina May. I'm the environmental lead on the study, and I work in the Baltimore, Maryland District Office. I am currently on slide 25. So in the last quarterly stakeholder webinar, I discussed the key takeaways from the draft U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Planning Aid Report for SACS. Since then, the report was finalized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The report provides a state-by-state description of the national wildlife refuges and biological resources and habitats that are under the purview of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm activity in each state and territory located in the SACS study area. So there were a few changes between the draft and the final reports, including the addition of discussions of adaptation strategies for some of the national wildlife refuges. And I will be highlighting a few of those adaptation strategies on the next slide. So how is this information going to be used from the report? The information is currently being used in the SACS state appendices, and it will also be used in the SACS environmental analysis that I will briefly discuss in a couple of slides. Information from the report could also be used for other core studies outside of the SACS. The final report is located on the SACS website at the link shown on your screen. Next slide, please. I'm on slide 26. So I wanted to highlight a few of the adaptation strategies that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service discussed in the final planning aid report. So the first one is the Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge. It is a migratory bird refuge located along the coast of South Carolina. Sea level rise and worsening storm surge are concerns within the Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge. In some parts of the refuge may lose approximately half of their beach habitat, and saltwater inundation will shift some of these freshwater habitats to brackish or tidal communities. So the recommendations included in the report include the expansion and connection of protected areas, allowing for the creation of habitat corridors across the topography of the ecosystem. And these corridors will allow habitats to shift their ranges as storm surge conditions continue to change. The next example is the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. It is located along the southwest coast of Florida on the barrier island of Sanibel. And this refuge is part of the largest undeveloped mangrove ecosystem in the United States. And the U.S. Geological Survey has installed surface evaluation tables to measure the effects of sea level rise on mangroves. And the USGS will continue to test the soil and the peat under the mangroves to determine carbon storage rates, economic values, ecosystem services, and future distribution and abundance of these mangroves. And lastly, the Bon Secours National Wildlife Refuge, which is located on the Gulf Coast near the city of Gulf Shores, Alabama. This refuge was established for the protection of migratory songbird habitat and threatened and endangered species. The refuge also protects the last remaining undisturbed beach mouse habitat found in Alabama. So through a partnership between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Conservation Fund, and the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, 470 acres of coastal habitat was purchased and added to the National Wildlife Refuge. And this land was previously slated for residential and commercial development. On to the next slide, please. So I'm on slide 27. Next, I wanted to provide a brief overview of how the SACS is looking at vulnerability of environmental resources and what we have found so far. So the SACS environmental team has been working on an analysis to identify natural areas at risk to increase coastal storm damages as a result of sea level rise. And each district environmental team member has scored the vulnerability of the natural areas in their state to several coastal storm hazards, including storm surge inundation, saltwater inundation, erosion and wave attack, and wind. And for mapping purposes, the natural areas were placed into their appropriate NOAA CCAP classes. And the CCAP classes, as well as their scores, were overlaid onto the Cat 5 maximum of maximum footprint. And so this slide shows an example of one of the maps that was created. This map was developed for Georgia, and a map is going to be developed for every state and territory. So as you can see for the Georgia map, as expected, the estuarine emergent wetlands show a lower vulnerability than the evergreen or mixed forest classes. This is still a working draft. There may be some changes to these maps. The other thing I wanted to mention is there will also be a web map application that will complement these maps that will allow the user to zoom in and out of the maps to get a better picture of the vulnerability in the CCAP classes. So the next step for the environmental team is to develop criteria and to identify the environmental high-risk areas. And then the environmental team will present their findings at a state and agency environmental workshop at the end of July. Next slide, please. So I'm on slide 28. So for the SACS Cultural Resources Assessment, the SACS Cultural team is working on a qualitative analysis to identify cultural and archaeological resources in the SACS study area that are at risk to increase coastal storm damages as a result of sea level rise. And these write-ups will be included in the state appendices. So I wanted to highlight a couple of the findings of the qualitative analysis. So the first one, at the Ghana Tolomato Matanzas National Estuarine Research Reserve in Fort Matanzas, there were 61 recorded archaeological sites. There is a Minorcan well and other archaeological resources adjacent to the Tolomato River, as well as Fort Matanzas National Monument, and these are all at risk to erosion. And then the next example is at Sapelo Island, Georgia. There's a culturally significant community located in a low elevation on the south side of the island that is susceptible to flooding from coastal storm surges that will worsen with sea level rise. So these are just a couple of examples that the archaeologists have found through their qualitative analysis, and the SACS cultural team will present the rest of their findings during a state and agency cultural workshop later this summer. And now I will pass it on to Kelly Legault for an engineering update.
Thanks very much. This is Kelly Legault. I'm the engineering technical lead for the SACS, and I sit in the Jacksonville district with the Army Corps of Engineers. Today, I just want to give a very brief update on some results that we have from the probabilistic coastal hazard analysis for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. On this particular slide, we're on slide 30. The upper panel illustrates the results, which describe the 100-year storm surge under present-day conditions. The median surge for the entire set of save points for Puerto Rico and USVI, there are about 6,000 of them. And it's also important to note that they extend rather far offshore. But in a general sense, the median surge reported here for all of these points is approximately 1 meter. Surges are higher along the coast as illustrated here, and you can see that the colors go up to about the 3 and 3.5 meter surge range for the 100-year storm. The lower panel illustrates results which describe the same type of storm, the 100-year storm, and this is surge under sea level rise conditions for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers high scenario in 2120, which equates to 2.13 meters, approximately 7 feet of sea level rise. The median surge elevation for all of the save points here is approximately 3 meters above present day sea levels. If you go to the next slide. So the upper panel here, we wanted to look at the amplification of the 100-year storm surge under sea level rise conditions. And here you can see that regions around Arecibo and around San Juan, as well as along the shorelines of St. Thomas and also St. John are subject to storm surges that will be greater in the future, not only due to local sea level rise, but also due to frictional effects which will enhance storm surge. And typically this occurs due to frictional losses for low-lying wetland regions that are impacted and flooded by sea level rise. In the lower panel, we look at the increase in wave height associated with the 100-year storm, and it's found that the median wave height is increased in excess of 1 meter for Puerto Rico and USVI for sea level rise conditions. If you go to the next slide, which will be slide 32. Finally, we look at an examination of the increase in wave energy that arrives at the shoreline, which can in turn do work on beaches and on coastal structures. And it can be seen that wave energy will be expected to increase significantly along the north coast of Puerto Rico, as well as regions along the southeast coast. In addition, there are sites along St. Thomas, St. John, St. Croix, which can be expected to experience significant increases in wave energy owing to the complex geometry of those islands and the nearshore bathymetry. So that was my brief update for some of the coastal hazard system probability analysis for the numerical model results that came out of CStorm. I'd like to now introduce Jennifer Bywater with CDM Smith to talk a bit about institutional and other barriers.
Great, thank you, Kelly. So these next couple of slides provide an update on some of the stakeholder feedback we received during our regional workshops held last fall. One topic of discussion at those workshops was institutional and other barriers that were limiting efforts in improving coastal resilience. So the feedback we received was classified into 6 major themes seen on the pie chart here. You can see that the feedback was well distributed between the themes, with leadership and institutional coordination coming up most often as a noted barrier. Each of the major themes was then further subdivided into sub-themes, with the top 5 identified sub-themes also listed on the slide. So this next slide shows a similar breakdown of the feedback into the 6 major themes, but this time it's separated into the individual states and territories instead of for the planning region as a whole. And this allows a view of some of the geographical variance in the responses. During the field workshops, we also asked participants for policy or legislative solutions to help address the identified barriers, with again the top 5 recommendations shown on the slide. A full report documenting the feedback received is one of the key SACS products, and a draft should be available around the end of the year. With that, that wraps up our discussion of updates to the regional products, and we'll now move into updates from individual districts. First up is going to be Wilmington.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Glazner. I'm a planner with the North Carolina SAC study. Brendan Dooley is the project manager, has his contact information there on the slide. So this next slide, it really provides some background on what we've done to date and where we're headed. Last fall, we conducted stakeholder workshops and received a lot of feedback and input, which we used to greatly help us in delineating and selecting our potential focus areas for North Carolina. Since the Tier 1 analysis was complete, we've been working on Tier 2, and we've been using that input for workshops. Also, in addition to that, using local, state, and regional data sets. We've used the Tier 2 not just to identify additional high-risk areas in North Carolina, but also to add layers of potential risk to areas in addition to the inundation hazard that Tier 1 looked at. So for the state of North Carolina, risk areas are being determined primarily via census place and through a set of specific screening criteria. The purpose of the SAC study, for the purposes of the study, for an area to be considered high risk, it would need to meet at least one of the following criteria. The first one being if it was considered high risk in Tier 1. A second trigger would be that using the HAZUS inundation damage rating, if it had a rating of medium high to high, that would trigger a high risk area for our state. Another trigger would be if it meets the critical erosion area threshold that we've been developing for this study, which I'll touch on in here just a second. A fourth trigger for an area to be designated high risk in North Carolina would be seasonal population, which we've assumed for all shorefront communities based on comparative data that we found within the state. And then lastly, Tier 2 environmentally vulnerable areas, which is in development, but that's also being incorporated into our Tier 2 analysis. So although there are other risks also identified in North Carolina, those risks I just ran through were considered significant factors in determining a higher risk of population, infrastructure, and environmental and cultural resources. So looking ahead, there are the environmental workshops coming up that Christina just discussed. We also have our focus area action strategy kickoff webinars coming up in a couple of weeks. There's 3 of them for our 3 focus areas. The first one being Dare County / Outer Banks, and that one will be on Wednesday, July 15th. The second one is for the Carteret Craven Counties focus area, and that'll be the next day on July 16th. And then the third focus area, which is New Hanover / Brunswick counties, that focus area action strategy kickoff webinar will be on Friday morning, July 17th. So this here just quickly as an example, these maps just show how we went about determining our critical erosion areas for North Carolina. And what we've done in our state is we utilize existing state Division of Coastal Management shoreline change rate data, which was just updated in 2019. And based off of USGS report for the Mid-Atlantic states, we took an erosion rate of 3 foot or greater, which we were considering high erosion. And then we overlaid that with our Tier 1 exposure, composite exposure map to essentially say, okay, what areas not only have what we would consider high erosion, but that there's valuable resource being threatened behind that erosion, whether it's an environmental habitat or some type of population or infrastructure. And that's an example of a process we went through for either identifying additional high-risk areas or adding kind of more depth to, what is threatening some of these areas beyond simply the inundation. The next slide has a couple more maps. The one on the left, the pie chart, that's from the National Structure Inventory Database, and that's for one of our planning reaches in North Carolina, but it shows the estimated exposure value that's at risk within the state. The map on the right is an EPA data set, the ICLUS data that Matt talked about earlier, but it lets us see for North Carolina projections, which show expected development over the coming decades, overlaid with areas of storm surge risk. That it's just additional data, as we look deeper into it, that helps us hone in on certain areas and just paints a more detailed picture of what's going on. There's a lot more that we want to talk about, so we really look forward to seeing you at the North Carolina Focus Area Action Strategy kickoff webinars in a couple weeks. So look forward to seeing you there. And at this point, I'm going to pass it on to Dan Perkins from South Carolina.
Thank you, Jason. So good afternoon, everyone, and a special welcome to all South Carolina stakeholders. My name is Diane Perkins, and I'm the PM and planner for the South Carolina State Appendix. My email is in the lower left corner of this slide. It's diane.perkins@usace.army.mil, and I welcome contacts regarding the South Carolina State Appendix. Next slide, please. Our South Carolina team has done a lot of work over the past 3 months that is parallel to what's being reported by the command team and other districts. This work is to identify places at risk of coastal storms and to identify ways that risk can be reduced. Before we touch on our new work, I want to remind us of what we've already found. And with Tier 1, using national data sets, we've already identified 32 places in South Carolina with existing risk at the medium high to high level. And when looking at future risk, found 3 more places with medium high to high level risk. Next slide, please. We have chosen to highlight for South Carolina today estimated exposure value and anticipated development pressure, because population and infrastructure are some of the main drivers for identifying high-risk areas. Shown here is SCO3, our northern planning reach for South Carolina. You can see on the left that we already have nearly $129 billion of existing infrastructure exposed. And between the red and the blue in the pie chart, that over 70% of this exposure is residential. You can see on the right that there will be development pressure, shown with red dots, that overlaps areas at risk of coastal storm surge, which is shown in blue. This represents increased future exposure of population and infrastructure to coastal storm risk. Next slide, please. This is SCO4, our southern planning reach for South Carolina. On the left, you can see that we already have over $224 billion of existing infrastructure exposed. And between the red and the blue in the pie chart, that nearly 70% of this exposure is residential. You can see on the right that there will be development pressure, shown with red dots, and that overlaps areas at risk of coastal storm surge risk, shown in blue. This represents increased future exposure of population and infrastructure to coastal storm surge risk. Next slide, please. So what has our Tier 2 analysis of population and infrastructure given us in terms of identifying high-risk places? HAZIS, which gives infrastructure damages, has helped us identify 3 additional places with existing risk at the medium high to high level, and 10 additional places with medium high to high level risk in the future. Our working draft erosion analysis already gives us yet another 9 places at medium high to high risk, and this work is still underway. Also under development, without any preliminary numbers just yet, are our cultural and environmental resource analyses. Even without those, so far we have already identified 22 additional places with our Tier 2 analyses for a current total of 57 places. That's 39% of South Carolina's high-risk places coming from our Tier 2 work, which is ongoing and may identify yet more. Next slide, please. So our way ahead, in addition to continuing our Tier 2 analyses, we are looking forward to 2 focus area action strategy components. This is 2 locations, one in the Grand Strand area and one in the Charleston metro area. And these are essentially example areas where we will be applying the tools and information of this study. And then in the future, referencing those examples, these same tools and information can be applied by others to address the remaining areas at risk. So our focus area action strategies, we're going to have kickoffs in July, and those are going to be on the 15th for the Grand Strand area and the 16th for the Charleston metro area, the workshops in August, and wrap-ups in September or October. We are, as Christina had mentioned, we are having more Tier 2 workshops in the near future also, with environmental resources for federal and state agencies and cultural resources with federal and state agencies. We are really looking forward to working with our South Carolina stakeholders in these upcoming workshops. And so I hope to see you all there on our virtual reality, just like today. And you're welcome to contact me with any questions in the meantime. That concludes South Carolina, and next is April Patterson presenting Georgia. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is April Patterson with the Savannah District, the project manager working on the Georgia appendix to the South Atlantic Coastal Study, and I can be reached at the email below. Savannah District has been working on this with all of you for about a year now, and did some work leading up to that as well. Last June, we started with working with Tybee Island to look at the current Tybee Island Shoreline Protection Project. And then in October of 2019, we met face-to-face with all of you for our kickoff face-to-face meeting at Tybee Island. And then following that meeting, we compiled some of the items that you all talked about as concerns and as potential risk areas into some interim study recommendations. And those are draft, and we look forward to continuing to work on those with you as we review the Tier 1 and Tier 2 risk areas, and looking forward to seeing how we can address risks along the Georgia coast. And then recently in June, we've met with the SAND stakeholders regarding regional sediment management projects or beneficial use of dredge material in Georgia. And that group developed the sand availability and needs determination using data from local sources and also from the Corps. And we look forward to sharing that with everybody and relooking at those RSM ideas as we move forward with the Georgia appendix. So we've worked on the Tier 1 data that we talked about back in October at our face-to-face meeting. And we've been evaluating our Tier 2 data sources. As Christina May mentioned, we are continuing to work on identifying those vulnerable environmental and cultural resource areas and meeting with federal and state agencies to discuss them and identify what areas might be at risk. Georgia has 2 focus areas, one including all of Glenn County, Brunswick, Jekyll Island, and St. Simons Island, and one including all of Chatham County, Savannah, and Tybee Island. So we will have those kickoff meetings July 13th and July 14th, and you should have received a save a date. If not, send me an email. On the right-hand side of the screen, you're seeing our Tier 2 data from the National Structural Inventory, showing exposure to structures based on different sectors and estimated exposure value of around $131 billion. And the average population at risk is approximately 500,000 people. Next slide. And as others have talked about, we've used the HAZUS flood model to look at high-risk locations. So exposure to populations and infrastructure and what that storm risk might look like in terms of asset risk. And as you can see here, a number of these census places were identified as having that risk in the metropolitan Savannah area, as well as St. Simons and Brunswick in that focus area. And outside of a focus area in Camden County, St. Mary's, Georgia, also has significant high risk. So we will continue to work on identifying those risks combined with environmental and cultural resource vulnerability and risk, and also social vulnerability as we move forward with continuing the study. thanks to all of you, we've, previous slide, please. We've collected a number of Tier 2 data sets from our state, local, and federal partners. So the FEMA HAZUS flood model that you're seeing on the right, the 2013 hurricane evacuation study that the Corps produced, the Western Shorebird Reserve Network, the NOAA EFH information, the NOAA CCAP classes, the resilient coastal sites for conservation from the Nature Conservancy. Thanks to our partners at the University of Georgia, we've captured that NARGIS data, the archaeological and historical resources information that you saw previously, and we'll look at here again, and the CDC information for social vulnerability taken from the 2010 census. Next slide. So looking at this data and how it looks on a map, on the right-hand column, you'll see that NARGIS data. So this is a map showing the abundance of cultural resources along the Georgia coast in the study area, the focus in the reach of the Georgia 05 planning reach. And we understand that this data is sensitive as to its specific location and what that cultural resource is, but want to get an idea of where these resources are and how they are at risk compared to other Tier 2 and Tier 1 data. And then on the left-hand side, you're seeing that CCAP class data that we looked at earlier with Christina May. And again, you're looking at the exposure to different vegetation types on the left and how they look with overlaid with the Category 5 maximum of maximum storms. And we will continue to work on this and combine different environmental resources and identify areas at risk for cultural and environmental resources. Additionally, we are looking at social vulnerability. I don't have a graphic to share with you today, but looking at things like the age breakdown of the population, populations that are seasonal or where there is potential population growth, and how, being 65 or older may impact evacuation decisions in counties like Glenn County and McIntosh County, and Chatham County, where a significant portion of the population, 9%, doesn't own a vehicle, and how that contributes to risk during coastal storms. So we look forward to continuing this conversation, and thank you for participating today and hearing an update about Georgia. I'll pass it off to Ashley Fountain with the Jacksonville District. Thanks.
Thanks, April. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashley Fountain, and I am the project manager for the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and majority of the Florida Appendices development. You can see my email down there at the bottom of the screen. So if you need to reach me, please just send me an email. Thanks. We are in full swing of our Tier 2 evaluation, as everyone else has been mentioning here. So that Tier 2 evaluation includes the focus area analyses. And out of the 21 focus areas for SACS, the Jacksonville District will be leading the conversation for 9 of those. You can see the map to the right of the screen. There are 5 focus areas for Florida in the Jacksonville District, and 2 each for Puerto Rico and the USCI. As Matt mentioned earlier, we'll be having a series of virtual workshops over the next few months, with kickoff workshops right around the corner. For Jacksonville District, those will be taking place from July 9th through July 17th. And at these workshops, we'll be fact-checking and building upon our Tier 2 analyses. Today, I'm going to preview what we've been up to since we last convened. So over the next few slides. Thank you. Like I said, we've been building on our overall Tier 2 analyses, and I know you've seen this table or a version of it previously today. So our Tier 2 analysis, again, is more than just the focus areas. This is a snapshot from Florida's Tier 2 list of high-risk places. It's still working draft, as you can see, but the preliminary numbers show that there are 742 high-risk areas from both Tier 1 and Tier 2. So breaking that down a little bit, the 263 census places that are high risk in the existing conditions from Tier 1, 379 census places are high risk in the future condition with sea level rise from Tier 1. So that's 116 additional places from sea level rise. And that's just for Florida. So through Tier 2, we concluded through HAZUS and for the critically eroded areas that there are an additional 57 high-risk locations using the critical erosion layer, and HAZUS provided or contributed an additional 43 locations of high risk. That HAZUS data was also really helpful for defining the boundaries for our focus areas, so it was really great to have that. And collectively, looking at the big picture of all of these, our Tier 1 and Tier 2, it really helped us to refine our problem statements and our appendix and our draft problem statements for our focus areas. Next slide. In addition to what is being developed through SACS, our study teams are also taking into account other efforts going on in our region. As you may know, the Jacksonville District has quite a list and the supplemental coastal studies going on right now. So much so that we've enlisted help from other core districts. And I've been asked how are all of these ongoing study teams coordinating with each other? You can see the Miami-Dade draft report. It was just released recently. And I think if you click another slide, it's animated. Oh wait, sorry, go back, please. Okay, so you've got the Miami-Dade, you've got the Puerto Rico, so we've got a lot of studies going on right now within our region. One of the 6 SACS goals is being to leverage ongoing stakeholder efforts, and we're kind of required to do that. So I just want to recap a few ways of how we are leveraging other ongoing stakeholder efforts, specifically the supplemental actions right now. The SACS Tier 1 Risk Assessment GeoPortal has been used by a number of the feasibility study teams to refine and validate study areas. It's really helpful we've been told it was really helpful to rapidly identify areas of potential risk, and specific examples include the Miami Back Bay feasibility study team, which used the SACS Tier 1 to verify potential at-risk areas for their alternative analysis. The Puerto Rico Coastal Storm Risk Management Study Team used the SACS Tier 1 for screening to focus on the higher potential risk areas. The San Juan Metro Study Team used the Tier 1 to verify social vulnerability within high storm surge risk areas. And the San Juan Metro Back Bay team also used ADCIRC and ST-Wave data from SACS to identify areas for storm surge risk. And one last example, HAZUS data from SACS was used by the Miami-Dade Coastal Storm Risk Management Study Team to help identify potential risk areas for Key Biscayne. So these are ways that teams are using SACS data, but in many cases, SACS is attempting to pick up where those study teams had to do some screening out at times, and then pick up and go and run from that point. Next slide. So like this slide says, information exchange internally and externally. We have been having information exchange externally as well. So even in the midst of a global pandemic, I just have on the screen a few stakeholder products that we have learned through coordination recently in this virtual age over the past several months. This first one is the Northeast Florida Regional Council's Building Community Resilience tool, really useful tool that I think will pull into our focus area analyses. The next one is and I'm on slide 54 right now. The next one is the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council Sea Level Rise and Storm Surge Viewer for Volusia County, which is another great tool that we could use in our focus area. And these are exactly the kinds of products that we're looking for our Tier 2 analysis. So even if you're not in the focus area, we can pull these into our Tier 2. This slide and the next slide are just previews to additional analyses being conducted by our amazing project delivery team. This table represents a Tier 2 analysis underway for Southeast Florida, again, working draft, but we are taking available information, and that's key to point out there, available information from the South Florida Water Management District on their tidal control structures, and doing a preliminary evaluation of when these structures will potentially be vulnerable to sea level rise. These tidal control structures represent the interface of the South Atlantic Coastal Study limits and the Central and Southern Florida project. And so this table is how our team is making the connection between those two very large efforts. And the sea level rise projections will be in line with the curve used by the regional stakeholders. Next slide. And this is my last slide. I just wanted to close with a couple of draft maps from the Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands environmental analyses that are underway by Christina May and the environmental team. The SAC study area as a whole has many vulnerable environmental resources, but these two territories, being that they are islands, have some unique environmental resources that are particularly vulnerable to coastal storms as a result of sea level rise. So I wanted to point these out. I look forward to continuing the dialogue with you all and diving into the development of our focus area action strategies at our workshops kicking off next month. Thank you. That's all for me. On to Meredith Ledart.
Thanks, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meredith Ledart. I am the project manager for the SACS PDT in Mobile, and we are developing the Mississippi and Alabama state appendices, as well as providing support to Ashley and her team for any information that's needed for the Florida Panhandle. Next slide. All right, so just a quick status update. We did provide an update when we had the last quarterly webinar, and since then we've completed our initial Tier 2 risk analysis, as well as we've held our SAN stakeholder workshop in Mobile last week. And so kind of coming up is additional information as part of our Tier 2 analysis, including evaluating our vulnerable environmental and cultural resources and coordinating that with our federal and state agencies. So Christina mentioned we are going to have an environmental and cultural workshop later in July. And then we also have our focus area action strategy meetings for Mobile District. So we have 2 in Mississippi at Gulfport, Biloxi, 1 in Pascagoula, 1 in Western Mobile Bay, and then 2 in the Florida Panhandle, 1 to include Bay and Gulf County, Florida, and the other 2 include the Pensacola, Eglin, all the way essentially to Destin areas, focus areas. So these are going to be scheduled for the week of July 13th through the 17th. And the first initial meetings will be shorter, 90 minutes, all virtual. And then our second follow-up, more detailed workshops, ours are going to be the first week of August. So you should have invites for those if you fall within one of our focus areas. Next slide. So this is kind of highlights of similar information that you've seen from the other teams that denotes our high-risk areas based on the existing as well as with future sea level rise. One of the important really items to note for the analysis that we had was that a lot of the additional Tier 2 data that we used, including hazardous damages, confirmed of what we evaluated in Tier 1 in areas that were identified as medium or medium high risk were essentially equivalent based on some of the hazardous damage information that we had, or often found to be very high risk. So many of these areas are included within one of our focus areas. However, for example, Lake Orange Beach is a high risk area, not included in one of the focus area action strategies, but the products that we are producing as part of SACS, as well as some of the sample strategies that are going to be available, for example, in the Alabama state of Tennessee, can be replicated by some of these other areas that were not able to be included in a focus area. All right, next slide. So this is kind of a highlight of some of the environmental work that we've completed so far. We have mapped essentially critical habitat areas for Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And a lot of these, I think, key environmental areas are also for Mississippi falling within our focus areas. So we know we have sturgeon, sandhill crane, piping plovers, things like that are key species that we're looking at. The second step that's being completed is completing the vulnerability analysis and identifying those priority environmental areas that are going to be coordinated with input from our federal and state partners. Next slide. So in Alabama, very similar. Christina mentioned that we do have one of the key wildlife refuges from Bon Secours, which has to do with the last, basically undisturbed beach mouse habitat that we've identified here. Next slide. There we go, thank you. And this is the Panhandle, Florida area that we've identified with critical habitat supporting piping plover and Gulf sturgeon. And many of these areas also happen to fall within one of our focus areas moving forward that we're going to have this targeted meetings. So we do appreciate everybody's time and the workshops that we have had and the participation that we've received. If you have any questions for me regarding any of this information, please do reach out. And we look forward to continuing to working with you as we move along the study. Thanks so much. Pam, over to you.
All right, Meredith, thank you so much. Now, that was a lot of great information, and I really would like to thank our study team for providing everybody with such a comprehensive update. But I also know it's a lot to absorb in kind of rapid fire. So at this point, I'd like to encourage everybody to please take a closer look at our GeoPortal and our webpage, where you can move through some of our study products at your leisure and kind of walk through this presentation as well at your own pace. And we are always looking for feedback, for your feedback, to ensure that our analyses are pretty much on point and have practical application, not just for the Corps, but for you as well, and leverage all the good work that you or your organization or your agency has completed. So again, please don't hesitate to provide your feedback, reaching out to any of us, either through the SACS email box or directly via all the team contact information that's in the presentation. Now, as our district project managers just kind of wrapped up talking about, up next, we're really looking forward to a series of focus area workshops in all of our states and territories, supporting the development of detailed focus area action strategies, as well as state and agency workshops for agency collaboration on in-progress assessment of vulnerable environmental and cultural resources. Our coastal program guide development will get underway towards this coming December. And as we round the corner into the new year, we're going to be working to aggregate our analyses and report products, moving toward publication of the full draft report package next October. Now with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this update today and for all of your good questions that I see coming in through the chat. I'm going to turn the mic back over to Jenny so that we can get to some of those questions before we wrap up. And again, any questions that we don't get to, we'll make sure we provide responses to and post on our webpage. Jenny?
Great, thanks, Pam. As you mentioned, we have received quite a few questions, so thank you everyone for submitting those. I think we'll go back to kind of the start as questions came in as we moved through our presentation. So there's kind of a series on the SAND effort. Clay, if you want to open your line. One of the first questions was on who attended those SAND stakeholder meetings, what kind of stakeholders were they, and if reports for what was discussed and found at the individual meetings would be available.
Yes. Okay, so the people that attended the stakeholder meetings, we developed a stakeholder group, a more technical stakeholder group looking at town owners and municipalities that knew specific information about the beach nourishment projects. And so we focused on them, and then we expanded it out to some others within the SACS group. And so what was discussed, if you looked on the slide, there was an FTP site to pull up all the presentations. And so the information that will be available to you is the presentation themselves, which looks at every county throughout the specific state or district, and then and shows the results. As far as discussion, we had a little bit of discussion. We do have some internal meeting notes, but we don't plan to post those.
There was some additional questions still on that same topic in terms of how is sand within a 3-mile boundary protected for local nourishment projects compared to outside the 3-mile boundary?
Okay, so the Corps of Engineers does not regulate the use of sand. We do not permit it. And so 3 miles is obviously, in most cases, is the state and federal boundary. And so inside of 3 miles, the state makes those decisions. And then outside of 3 miles is made by the federal government and BOEM. So we are not going to discuss that. We're not going to have the discussion about protecting projects for the locals or anything like that at all in the sand study.
Then I think one more question for you for the time being. So it's related probably to the question above. Was there any chance of non-United States sources, such as the Bahamas, to at least be a part of the recommendation to lower costs and broaden sources?
Not at this point, no.
Okay. Idris, there was a question, I think, on your economic section on, is this economic information available now or is it coming?
The information is, for the most part, it's complete. It needs to be updated and add some items added to it in order to release it to the public so that it would make it easier to digest. The overall plan is to release it to the public, but there's still a few items left to add to it.
Okay. And then I think the next one, Christina, maybe was for you. Was year-round dredging proposed to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
I'm assuming they're talking about the planning aid report, the adaptation strategy discussions. I did not see anything regarding dredging in those discussions.
Kelly, I think there's a few that, or Pam, did you have additional information there?
Yeah, I was just kind of going to add in there, Jenny, year-round dredging, you know, as we're at this stage, you know, SACS is not recommending specific projects for implementation, but year-round dredging, I think, as a strategy is something that certainly maybe even under regional sediment management strategies is something that the SACS certainly could take a look at and consider in an overall context relative to how effective that type of an approach would be towards reducing risk and optimizing regional sediment management actions and activities. It would not be something that we, the SACS team, would go back to Fish and Wildlife Service and propose. It would be something that we could maybe identify as a strategy and lay out the logic for, and then hopefully maybe through the SACS platform get the dialogue started relative to that as a concept. But that's just kind of a general response on I think what the question might have been on year-round dredging. Thank you.
No, that's helpful context. Thank you. Kelly, there's a few that came in from your presentation on the coastal hazard system.
Okay.
One question was, will the methodology applied to Puerto Rico wave analysis be performed for Florida?
Yes.
And I believe you'll perform it for the whole planning area, is that correct?
Correct. It would be performed for the whole AOR. At present, they're still running CStorm and then need to do the joint probabilistic analysis for the Southeast Atlantic, and then we'll be doing that for the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay. There's a few additional questions. One is, do the higher wave and storm surge heights assume loss of tidal wetlands with sea level rise?
Yeah, those tidal wetlands that are below, in this particular instance, 7 feet above MSL for the center of the most recent tidal epoch, which is 1992. If those areas are inundated, it's assumed that they are lost to sea level rise.
And then there's a question on the water surface elevation. The question was in reference to what datum? And then there was also kind of a suggestion on just using the 100-year storm language, and if that might cause some confusion in terms of communicating risk.
Okay. So yes, the model and the outputs right now are relative to mean sea level, which is centered at the 1992. This is the latest tidal epoch. NOAA will be updating their epoch in 2022. So at this point, it's 1992 epoch MSL. And then the 100-year flood, yeah, maybe that would be a good discussion to have. We're very used to the FIS studies and that language from our flood map hazards, but it might be something to explore in the focus area workshops.
It's always good to keep in mind. There was one more question. I'm not sure if it relates to you, but it was just if we could, if stakeholders could download the model outputs in terms of waves and so.
Right. So on the CHS website, users will be able to download the annual exceedance probabilities in terms of water levels. All of these should be converted to NAVD 88 once they're on the website. Also, wave characteristics. So we'll have them for present mean sea level, which again is centered at this recent epoch in 1992. They'll be able to download them for 2 cases of sea level rise. In addition, you'll be able to get hydrographs for the mean sea level, again centered at 1992, and also for 2 instances of sea level rise. So you'll be able to get the hydrographs for each of those storms. And the next thing that still needs to be calculated are those nonlinear residuals that we were showing in the areas around, for example, Arecibo, where you'll have changes in the quality and the output of the storm magnitude in and of itself, just due to frictional effects. And so that will all be available once the data are posted onto the CHS, which may not happen until at least a year from now.
Thanks, Kelly. Our next question came in specifically for Jason in the Wilmington district, but I have a feeling that it'd be good information kind of for all stakeholders. The question was if there was kind of a list available of stakeholders invited to the focus area meetings, and if others would be able to attend one or more of the focus group meetings. Pam or Matt, I don't know if you want to address kind of for the whole study area, or if Jason wants to speak just to North Carolina.
I would ask Jason to speak for North Carolina, since that's where the question was originally aimed.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, we have a pretty extensive stakeholder list for each of the focus areas. If you're wanting to attend one of the meetings, then you'd be more than welcome. I would try to think of the best way. I saw your name, but I wasn't sure what agency or group you might be with. But if we can get your contact information, then you could be added to the stakeholder group. I don't know if there's a specific focus area meeting you're more interested, but whatever the best way is to get your contact information to extend the invitation to. Lisa, I don't know if you have a recommendation for that.
Jenny, I was just going to follow up on Jason's comment and elaborate at your suggestion on the whole study. So each district has developed a list of key stakeholders within each focus area to initiate the dialogue and the coordination and the collaboration. If you believe you will fall into that category and you're located or have a significant interest in one of those focus areas, then my recommendation would be that you reach back to the district project manager and initiate that coordination relative to your interest in any particular focus area.
Great. There's a similar question for the upcoming environmental meetings, whether they would be open to nonprofit organizations as well as the state and federal agencies.
This is Christina. I am not sure about that. That's something I'll have to talk to the team about.
Yeah, so Christina, just following up on that as well, we can certainly have a dialogue on that. The intent and the purpose of those agency coordination workshops is to take, of course, the great analysis that you and the environmental sub-team have pulled together relative to vulnerable environmental resources and share those with state and federal agency partners and kind of start to get some of that feedback incorporated in kind of finalizing those draft analyses as we look next year towards posting that draft report. If there are NGOs that want to participate in that, I think that we would welcome that. Again, we're really looking that those are your team is about to embark on some fairly technical discussions relative to that vulnerability analysis. So to that extent, I think if you are with an NGO and you have an interest in those workshops, please reach out to Christina directly, and we can go from there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I saw there was I was seeing if there was other related questions. There is one question on will stakeholder meetings be hosted for remote participation? And my understanding is they all are happening remotely. Is that correct, Pam?
I'm sorry, Jenny, I was inadvertently talking over you. What was your question?
It was just confirming that all these stakeholder meetings that have been discussed, I assume both focus area and environmental and cultural workshops, are they happening remotely or available for remote participation?
They are. In light of COVID-19, we had originally intended on having those workshops face-to-face, and we have transitioned those into virtual platforms. So those focus area workshops will be held via webinar and will be completely remote.
A couple other questions. One is, will SACS attempt to quantify the timber asset value at risk in the vulnerability areas to add the other economic analysis being done? Who might be best to take that question?
I'll kick off. But Christina, I know that your team is considering the economic importance of some of the environmental resources ultimately in identifying at-risk resources, correct? I don't know that means that you'll be quantifying values, but anyway,
right.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So to the extent that timber resources, I would say at this point, the SACS does not have a scope element where we were going to try to capture the monetary value of timber resources. However, if timber resources are an environmental resource in a focus area, those focus areas will be looked at in some detail. So I think there may be an opportunity to get a little more granular on that analysis within focus areas.
There was also a question on that there was no kind of discussion today on sea level rise related saltwater intrusion impacts on aquifers or biodiversity. I assume the question is if that might be incorporated into some of the analysis. Who might be best to answer there?
As far as saltwater intrusion impacts and aquifers for at least the SACS environmental analysis, we are not looking at the impacts to aquifers. We defined environmental resources for SACS as basically natural areas or habitats. So we are not going to be looking at saltwater intrusion and aquifers.
Hey, Jenny, this is Matt. I'd just like to add to that, for overall, the SACS authority and guidance direct us to look at coastal storm damages increased by sea level rise. So overall, coastal storm damages and their increase with sea level rise is what the SACS and its components are focusing on. Saltwater intrusion or any potential hazard that's mainly sea level rise based, only sea level rise based, etc., may be discussed, but the focus is going to be on coastal storm damages and how they increase with sea level rise. So saltwater intrusion may be one of those, maybe kind of discussed in different ways, but won't necessarily be one of the focuses. That's it.
That's helpful, thank you. There's a few, I think, clarifications to some of the previous words. Back to you, Idris, just in terms of really verifying that timeline for release of the economic information to the public. Do you mind kind of stating how that might come out again?
Well, I have to consult with our geospatial lead on that in terms of when we can get all of the finalized numbers incorporated and whatever format that would come in terms of being releasable to the public as far as the damages overall. And then, you know, taking a rough stab at it, I would say within the next few months would probably be the earliest.
Yep, that's helpful. And then there was one follow-up for you, Kelly, as well, in terms of why do you assume wetlands below 7 feet will disappear in the modeling? Does SLAM modeling show that these areas will be unable to keep up with sea level rise? Not sure.
Yeah, we have not used a marsh equilibrium model for the sea storm. So as far as areas that were 7 feet, less than positive 7 feet MSL, those areas would be inundated in the model domain.
Great. Hopefully that is helpful. I think we've about reached the end of our questions. I know it sounds like a lot of people are kind of sending in their information in terms of being interested in the focus area workshops. Please do also include your affiliation and what area of the study you might be most interested in. Feel free to submit your information here, but also I will just go to this next slide. As mentioned, these slides will be posted on the SACS webpage. You can see that listed here in the kind of top left-hand corner of the slide. And you can reference this last slide, which includes everybody's title and email address to reach out for final communications. Unless anybody else sees kind of a question that came in that they know they wanted to answer, I think that might kind of wrap up our time today. Pam, do you have any last words?
Again, Jenny, I thank you for your assistance in facilitating our discussion today, and I want to thank everybody for participating on this webinar. So again, thank you. We value your input, continued dialogue with us. So please reach out to us, and we will be coming back to you through this same platform in 3 months to give you another update. So thank you.
Great. Well, that concludes our webinar today, and we look forward to you joining us next quarter.